On Wednesday night this past week, about 14 of us gathered in the fellowship room to explore the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is probably the most famous Unitarian who ever lived, and whose transcendentalist philosophy has spoken to millions and millions of people all over the world since he wrote his great works in the 1830s. Last week here in the service, we talked about Emerson's doctrine of the soul, and that sermon is up on our website if you'd like to listen to it or watch it. Thanks to Steve DeVoe for that. The gist of the oversoul, the doctrines, Emerson's doctrine of the soul, is that your relationship with the divine can only be had at first hand through direct experience, and it cannot be taught or given to you in creeds or in any traditional religious second-hand tradition. Traditional religion may be inspiring and important for gathering reverent people in community to do good things together and to face the ultimate questions together, Emerson believed. But the soul's relationship to the ultimate is a personal thing. And Emerson called it an invasion that happens in moments, an invasion to which we must be obedient. And he meant that in a loving way. He meant that we were invaded by the holy, and that when it worked through us, it was genius. And when it worked through our affections, it was love. And that we, in that way, were vehicles of God. And here is one of his quotes: "The soul gives itself alone, original and pure, to the lonely, original and pure." That same year that Emerson wrote his essay, The Oversoul, he also delivered an address to the graduating class of seminarians at Harvard Divinity School, wherein he expressed actually many of the same ideas that were in the Oversoul. He talked about corpse-cold religion, yikes, and criticized preachers who seemed more spectral, that is, sort of ghostly, than the blizzard outside the window of the church where they were sitting and where he had to listen to this boring sermon. And in the address to the graduating class of 1838, he also happened to refer to Jesus as one of a true race of prophets, which was not very orthodox, to say the least. And while his ideas thrilled many of the people who were there that day, they also infuriated many others. And some of those important religious leaders in the local area then started a pamphlet war and a letter to the editor kind of complaining campaign against him, against his take on religion and his insult to the traditional church. If there had been Facebook and blogging back then, he would have been at the center of a social media storm. People would have been there tweeting like, "Can you believe what this guy is saying?" and posting it on Facebook. And Emerson was an idealist, a great thinker with the heart of a capital R romantic. And the thing that we have to remember about him is that he considered himself a poet more than anything else. That was his favorite thing, was poetry. That's where his heart really was. So this firestorm of criticism really hurt him. And he wrote about it in his journal. He went to an event not long after he had created this furor, and he wrote in his journal, "Steady, steady. Who are these murmurers, these haters, these revilers? Men of no knowledge and therefore no stability." Of course, among those men who were criticizing him were some of his most important mentors. So you see a little defensiveness happening here. And he writes later in his journal, "It is a poor-spirited age. The great army of cowards who bellow and bully from their bedchamber windows have no confidence in truth or God." And of one of his main critics, a man named Anders Norton, he writes that he is trying to whip the naughty heretic. He had never meant to really be controversial. He meant to be inspiring in that address. He was excited by his insights, and he wanted to light a fire under this new group of ministers who were going out to serve our parish churches that he had actually himself resigned from recently in order to dedicate himself entirely to writing and lecturing. So he was heard. He was stung. And not long after that, he penned perhaps his most famous essay, the one that you may have read in junior high American Lit, called Self-Reliance. Okay, so we heard some of those excerpts that Jim just read. So you want to hear that now in that context. This essay, Self-Reliance, is often people's first acquaintance with Emerson, and they love it, especially if they discover it in their teen years. It's like a clarion call to teen rebellion in a way, you know. It contains many of Emerson's greatest hits, and I'll share some of them with you again, even though Jim read a couple of them. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. For nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string. Whoso would be a man, or he means mature person here, must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Now, these sentiments are dear to the heart of those who, if they are likely to become part of institutional religion, often find themselves in non-creedal communities such as ours in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. They are people who love those ideas are those who react very strongly to being given religious instruction or truths that do not hold up to the scrutiny of their own minds and square with their own direct experience. I told our class last week that all the Emerson phrases that I think apply most powerfully to the Unitarian Universalists that I have known in my life, this remark in the Divinity School address comes closest. And here it is. Listen to this. It's a little dense. This is 1830s language, so I will give you a little paraphrase after. I know it's early yet, you know, and some of you haven't had coffee. So here's this section, this passage. He writes, meantime, whilst the doors of the temple stand open, night and day, before every man, and the oracles of this truth cease never, it is guarded by one stern condition, this, namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction, but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What he announces, I must find true in me, or wholly reject. And on his word, or as his second, be he who he may, I can accept nothing. On the contrary, the absence of this primary faith is the presence of degradation. So to just kind of sum that up, what he is saying is religious truth, real ultimate truth is something that we receive firsthand through intuition, not because someone else, no matter how amazing they are, informs us of it. It isn't instruction. I can't be taught by someone else. I can only be provoked by them, and he means sort of somebody can only generate curiosity and interest for me. So I can't receive someone else's truth directly as an infusion. If I don't experience that truth firsthand as my own truth, someone inflicting their faith on me isn't inspiring, it's actually degrading. And a lot of you are going, yep. It resonates for those who wind up, if they get into traditional religious institutions at all, it resonates for Unitarian Universalists and other liberal religious faiths where you have the freedom to think for yourself and feel truth for yourself. So this is a wonderful statement of spiritual integrity for many people, just as the whole essay of Self-Reliance is a wonderful blueprint for non-conformity and individualism. And you know what? That was really important in the 1830s, in the 19th century, when religion and society in general were much more limited. Diversity was not a value that was lifted up. People were much more careful to have the same opinions in terms of religious life. I mean, certainly there was an intellectual ferment of ideas and opinions and so on, but there was not nearly access to the kind of information and the sort of emphasis on the self, quite frankly, as there is today. And what happened over time, and we really can either lay blame or credit at Emerson's feet for this in many ways, because he had a huge influence just as the Unitarian religion was getting started, you see. What happened is that individualism moved its way into our institutions, our congregations. And it became a legacy of people expecting congregational life to be tailored to them. So we ended up gathering congregations full of members who had the attitude that church was supposed to meet my needs, and the minister was supposed to speak to me at all times from the pulpit, and the congregation is supposed to live out what I think its mission in the world should be, because I have an intuition of what is best, and I must be accommodated. Uh-oh. Okay? So add to this instinct and this tendency and trend congregational polity, where every vote and every voice matters and is important. And the minister can be voted out for not keeping everyone happy. You just get 3 or 4 people who are like, I'm not, boom, out. And then later, as we move through history, our congregations have a tradition of serious anti-authoritarianism that also comes out of the 1960s. Some of you might remember that. And it undermines congregational leadership at every turn. This strong, overweening sense of individualism moves forward through the ages, as we sing, and it becomes a sense of personal entitlement. And the commitment to community becomes secondary as a very strong strain of narcissism moves into society. And we have all seen that. We have all participated in that. It's something that the marketplace really encourages, as they encourage all of us to think of ourselves as special snowflakes who need certain products that are geared toward our own needs, and everything is personalized, and everything is about, you should get what you deserve and be happy. So this really plays into our congregational culture. People leave when they don't get their way on fairly trivial matters. They dominate meetings. There are very poor boundaries. Leaders cannot move a meeting or an agenda forward because there's always someone who needs to be heard or quote unquote respected, who's going to invoke that first principle and say, you're not respecting my inherent worth and dignity. This doesn't apply to me. And this is a really, really important factor in congregational diminishing and failure. This is why many of us who have watched this trend all over our denomination and in the liberal church in general, and because society influences all these institutions, we went back to the covenant tradition out of which Emerson emerged, and which his cry to individualism balances. And so my colleague, the Reverend Fred Muir, wrote a really important piece on this just a couple of years ago, when he said that in order for Unitarian Universalism to survive, we need a new narrative, one that is community-centered and that honors individuality rather than individualism. You see the difference there? In his article, The End of iChurch, like iPhone, The End of iChurch, that appeared in the UU World in 2014, Fred said something that hit me pretty hard because I hadn't thought about it. He said that basically that he's heard cries in his own church and others too, quote, that we spend too much time and money on ourselves and we need to get out into the community and do more. And Fred writes, yes, I am sure we do need to do more. But I am convinced, he says, that we focus on reforming the world because the work of shaping and modeling our congregations as beloved communities and not as the iChurch is harder. It means addressing the challenges of individualism, exceptionalism, and authority. You know, that intuition of truth that Emerson says hits you, that hit me. What Fred Muir calls a storm of social transformation is upon us. It was certainly upon us when he wrote the article a couple years ago, and we are very much in the midst of it. So we can still embrace Emerson's clarion call to be true to ourselves, while also being dedicated to the efforts of the beloved community, which was Martin Luther King Jr.'s phrase, and that is defined by the Reverend Shirley Strong as an inclusive, interrelated society based on love, compassion, responsibility, shared power, and a respect for all people, places, and things. That is, a society that radically transforms individuals and restructures institutions. Emerson, in that work, Self-Reliance, and in his work in general, was not really about transforming individuals for their participation in a healthier community. He helped us to see, and we love him for this, I love him for this, that we must know who we are and that we must be true to our individuality. But moving into this more demanding era, or I would say moving into this demanding new era, requires that we shift our focus from self-reliance and individualism to interdependence, from I to us, and from me to community. Nothing else can move us forward.